Hi there, thanks for coming in today. It is great to meet you. We have had a chance to look over your portfolio and your experience over the last 3 years, and we are excited to dive deeper into your technical process. To start things off, why don't you just tell me a bit about your journey in VFX and animation so far?
Thanks for having me. It has been a whirlwind few years. I started out with a heavy focus on the technical side of T&D, but as I moved into my first mid-level roles, I found I really enjoyed the intersection of art and tech. I have spent the last 3 years focusing on a mix of hard surface modeling, character integration, and lighting. I have had the chance to take ownership of a few key features on smaller projects, which really helped me understand how to manage a pipeline from the initial blockout all the way through to the final composite. I try to approach every shot with a mindset of efficiency, making sure the visual quality is high without blowing out the render budget.
That sounds like a great foundation. Since you mentioned the pipeline, let's start with some of the fundamentals. In your workflow, how do you handle the distinction between geometric fidelity and visual fidelity? Do you find yourself prioritizing one over the other depending on the shot?
I think it is really important to distinguish the two. For me, geometric fidelity is all about the accuracy of the 3D model's shape and proportions. It is the precision of the mesh, the vertices, and the edges. If I am matching a real-world object or a specific concept design, the geometric fidelity has to be spot on, because if the proportions are wrong, no amount of lighting will fix it. Visual fidelity, on the other hand, is how the object actually looks when it is rendered. That is where the textures, shaders, lighting, and materials come in. I definitely prioritize them differently based on the shot. For example, if a character is in a wide shot and barely occupies 10% of the frame, I can afford to lower the geometric fidelity by simplifying the mesh, but I will keep the visual fidelity high with a great texture and lighting setup so it still reads correctly to the eye. If it is a close-up, both need to be at a maximum.
That makes a lot of sense. Speaking of detail, let's talk about optimizing that geometry. When you need a lot of surface detail but cannot afford the polygon count, how do you utilize Vertex normal maps?
Normal maps are a lifesaver for performance. Basically, instead of adding millions of polygons to create a small groove or a bump, I use a normal map to store directional information about how light should hit the surface at each vertex. It tricks the eye by altering the way the light reflects off the model, creating the illusion of complex geometry while the actual mesh stays relatively simple. It is an essential technique, especially when I am working on assets that need to be performant but still look high-end.
I noticed in your reel you have some great environment work. Let's talk about the technical side of that. Let's say you are working on a scene with a lot of complex movements. If you have a camera moving very quickly past an object, what techniques are you using in post-production to make that motion blur feel natural?
For that, I would go straight to a directional motion blur effect in compositing. While I try to get as much as I can from the 3D render, sometimes the native motion blur isn't enough or it's too computationally expensive to render at the level of quality I want. By applying a directional blur in post, I can simulate that natural smear you get when an object moves rapidly across the frame. The key is to make sure the blur is perfectly aligned with the camera's movement vector. Adjust the intensity to match the speed of the motion, which helps sell the illusion of high speed without needing to go back and reshoot or spend 10 more hours in a render queue. It makes the motion feel much smoother and more realistic.
Let's pivot to something a bit more complex. Imagine you have a shot where a digital animatronic puppet is interacting with live actors. The client comes back and says the puppet looks too digital, it just isn't blending. What is your process for solving that?
That is a common challenge. I would tackle it from both a technical and an artistic angle. Technically, I would look at the surface. Digital models often look too perfect, which is a dead giveaway. I would refine the textures and materials to add real-world imperfection, things like subtle scratches, a bit of dust, or even slightly uneven paint. I would also double-check the lighting. I need to make sure the puppet is reflecting and absorbing light in a way that perfectly matches the live-action plate. If the highlights on the puppet are too sharp compared to the actors, it will always look fake. Artistically, I would look at the animation. Digital movement can be too precise. I would tweak the motion to be more organic by introducing slight delays or imperfections, basically mimicking real-world physics where things don't stop and start instantaneously. I would also focus on the interaction. I would ensure the puppet is casting a believable shadow on the actors and that its physical presence is affecting the environment, even if it is just a slight nudge of a piece of clothing. That grounding is what really sells the integration.
Interesting. Let's dive into the rendering side of things. Can you explain the fundamental difference between rasterization and ray tracing? In what scenario would you choose one over the other?
Sure. Rasterization is essentially a faster technique that takes a 3D object and projects it onto a 2D screen, filling in the shapes with colors and textures. It is incredibly efficient and is the backbone of real-time applications like video games. However, it struggles with complex lighting, true reflections, and refractions because it is not actually simulating light, it is approximating it. Ray tracing is much more advanced because it actually simulates the physical behavior of light. It traces the path of light rays as they bounce off surfaces, which gives you incredibly accurate shadows, reflections, and refractions. If I am working on a final cinematic shot where realism is the priority, I am going with ray tracing. If I am working on a real-time preview or a project with an incredibly tight deadline, where a slight loss in lighting accuracy is acceptable for a massive gain in speed, rasterization is the way to go.
Let's apply that to a specific scenario. Suppose you have a scene with smoke interacting with harsh, directional sunlight. That is a tough one to get right. Which rendering passes are you implementing to make that feel realistic?
You definitely need a multi-pass approach for that to work. First, I would implement a volumetric pass. This is crucial because it simulates how light scatters through the smoke, giving it that sense of depth and density. Then I would need a shadow pass. Since sunlight is harsh, the smoke needs to cast soft, semi-transparent shadows on the ground and other objects, but also allow some light to penetrate through it. I would also add a specular or highlight pass to get those subtle glints where the sunlight grazes the edges of the smoke. Then I would include a color bleed or absorption pass. Smoke isn't just a white or gray cloud. The color of the light shifts as it passes through thicker areas of the smoke. Finally, I would use a global illumination or ambient occlusion pass to integrate the smoke into the scene, simulating the indirect light bounce. By separating these into passes, I can fine-tune the transparency and the glow in compositing without having to re-render the whole thing.
That is a very thorough approach. Let's talk about scene organization for a moment. For those who might not know, can you explain what a null object is in 3D software and how you specifically use them in your animation workflow?
A null object is basically an invisible, non-renderable placeholder. It has no geometry of its own, so it doesn't show up in the final render. I use it primarily as a control point or a parent. For example, if I have a complex group of objects that all need to move together, I parent them all to a null. Instead of animating 10 different objects, I just animate the null and everything follows. In animation specifically, I use them as targets for constraints. If I have a character's eyes following a moving object, I might use a null as the lookat target. It simplifies the rigging and makes the camera movements much easier to manage because I have a neutral anchor to rotate or scale around without messing up the individual transformations of my main. Said.
Moving into animation principles, you've mentioned your experience with character work. If you had to pick 3 essential animation principles that govern believable movement, which ones would you choose and why?
I would go with squash and stretch, anticipation and follow-through. Squash and stretch is fundamental for giving objects a sense of weight and flexibility. If a character lands from a jump, they shouldn't just stop, they should squash down to show the impact of the force. It makes the character feel like they are made of organic material rather than rigid plastic. Anticipation is what tells the audience what is about to happen. If a character is about to sprint, they need to lean back or wind up first. Without anticipation, the movement feels abrupt and robotic. And follow-through is what prevents that robotic feel at the end of a movement. If a character stops running suddenly, their hair, clothes, or arms should continue to move forward for a few frames. It is that overlapping action that creates the illusion of real physics and inertia.
You've mentioned physics and inertia. Let's talk about fluid simulations. If you were tasked with a project requiring fluid dynamics, how would you decide between using a flip solver versus an SPH solver?
It really depends on the scale and the type of fluid. Flip or fluid implicit particle is my go-to for large-scale simulations. If I am doing ocean waves, a massive waterfall, or a flooding scene, flip is the answer. It uses a grid to track motion, but keeps particles for the detail, which makes it very stable and efficient for high-resolution, large-volume effects. SPH, or smooth particle hydrodynamics, is much better for smaller-scale, high-detail behaviors. If I need to simulate a glass of water splashing, or something more viscous like honey or thick slime, SPH is more flexible. Since it treats the fluid entirely as particles, it handles irregular shapes and intricate interactions much better. However, it can be computationally heavier and less stable when you try to scale it up to a massive ocean. So for performance and scale, I'll use flip. For intimate, complex fluid detail, I'll use SPH.
Let's talk about the higher level management of a shot. When you're combining multiple complex elements, say a character, a massive explosion, and environmental debris, how do you manage the performance budget while still maintaining the artistic intent?
That is always a balancing act. My first step is to prioritize. I identify what the focal point of the shot is. If the emotional core of the scene is the character's face, that is where I spend my polygon and texture budget. The distant environmental effects or the back end of an explosion can be simplified significantly because the viewer's eye isn't focusing there. I use level of detail or LOD techniques to reduce complexity where it is not noticeable. I also optimize shaders using simpler versions for background elements. I make it a point to collaborate with the director and the tech lead early on to set hard limits on poly counts or texture sizes so we don't hit a wall during the final render. I also use profiling software to find the actual bottlenecks. If I see that the transparency in the smoke is what's killing the render time, I can optimize just that element without compromising the overall artistic vision.
I want to touch on something a bit more scientific. If you were asked to simulate the interaction of heat, like thermal transfer, across different materials like metal, wood, and fabric, how would you approach that convincingly?
To make that scientific, I would start by researching the thermal properties of those specific materials, specifically thermal conductivity, heat capacity, and emissivity. Metal conducts heat quickly, while wood and fabric are insulators. I would use physics-based equations, essentially the heat equation, to model how that temperature changes over time and space. For the visualization, I would map those temperature values to visual cues. For metal, I might use a glow map to show the heat radiating from a source and spreading. For wood, I would focus on the charring and the gradual transition from a burnt edge to a healthy surface. For fabric, I would look at the way it curls and shrivels as it burns. The goal is to ensure the simulation respects the laws of physics, but since this is VFX, I would optimize it so it looks right to the eye without needing a full-scale scientific laboratory. Simulation.
Let's switch gears to the camera. How does the physical camera model, things like lens distortion and sensor size, impact your workflow, especially when you are dealing with anamorphic footage?
The physical camera model is everything when you are trying to blend CGI with live action. If the live plate has barrel or pincushion distortion, my 10D renders have to match that perfectly, or the edges of the assets will look like they are floating. Sensor size dictates the field of view and the depth of field, so I have to match my virtual camera to those specs to ensure the perspective and the blur are consistent. Anamorphic footage adds a whole other layer of complexity. You have to deal with horizontal lens flares and that distinct oval bokeh. If I just use a standard spherical render, it will look completely wrong. I have to simulate those anamorphic characteristics in the render or in post. Also, since anamorphic footage is often stretched, I have to account for the desqueezing process during compositing. If the renders aren't aligned with the transformed plates, the perspective will be off and the whole illusion breaks.
That leads me to a tougher question about organic simulations. What are the theoretical challenges of simulating biological decay or organic material breakdown realistically within a constrained timeframe?
The biggest challenge is the timescale. In reality, decay happens over months or years through complex chemical reactions and microbial activity. In a shot, I might have to compress that into 3 seconds. The hurdle is making that compression feel believable rather than just looking like a fast-forwarded texture swap. I have to model the gradual breakdown of the structure, the tissue softening, the color shifting from healthy to necrotic, and the degradation of the texture. Then there is the interaction with the environment. If the organic matter is decaying, it usually attracts insects or grows fungi. Simulating those as procedural systems that interact with the decaying mesh is computationally expensive. The key is to find the visual shorthand, the most recognizable signs of decay, and prioritize those so the audience believes the process is happening, even if the actual simulation is a simplified version of the real chemistry.
Let's get into some of the practicals. Explain UV unwrapping to me. Why is it necessary and what happens if it's done poorly?
I like to describe UV unwrapping as taking a 10D model and unfolding it into a flat 2D layout, sort of like how you would unfold a cardboard box into a flat net. It is necessary because textures are 2D images. The UV map tells the software exactly which part of the 2D image corresponds to which part of the 10D surface. If it is done poorly, you get stretching and distortion. You'll see a texture that should be a perfect circle suddenly looking like an oval, or a seam that is painfully obvious because the texture doesn't align. It makes the model look unprofessional and breaks the immersion. Proper UV unwrapping ensures that the texel density is consistent across the model, so one area doesn't look blurry while another looks super sharp.
Speaking of texture and detail, you mentioned normal maps earlier. I want to be sure I understand. How specifically do they allow for surface detail without increasing the polygon count?
Right, so the core idea is that we aren't actually changing the geometry. The mesh remains simple. A normal map stores the vector information, the direction the surface is facing, at a very high resolution. When the renderer calculates how light hits the surface, it doesn't just look at the actual polygon, it looks at the normal map. If the normal map says the surface is actually tilting away at a certain point, the renderer calculates the light and shadow as if there were a bump or a groove there. So you get the visual result of a high poly model, like the pores on a character's skin or the threads in a piece of fabric, but the computer only has to process a simple, low poly mesh. It is all about manipulating the lighting calculation to create an illusion of complexity.
Let's talk about character data. When you are transferring rigging data between different pieces of software, which file formats are you using and why?
I mostly use FBX and Alembic. FBX is my standard for exchanging rigged characters and their animations. It is great because it preserves the hierarchy, the skeleton, and the skinning data. If I am moving a character from a modeling suite into an engine or another animation tool, FBX keeps the rig intact and functional. Alembic is different. I use Alembic when I need to transfer the final baked animation. It doesn't care about the rig or the skeleton, it just caches the vertex positions for every single frame. It is much more lightweight for the computer to read during the final render, and it is incredibly stable because you don't have to worry about the rig breaking or the skinning behaving differently. In another piece of software, it just plays back the geometry exactly as it was simulated.
That's a good distinction. Now let's talk about the early stages of a project. How do you approach the creation of an animatic to make sure the actual animation process goes smoothly?
For me, the animatic is the blueprint. If the blueprint is wrong, the whole house falls down. My goal is to nail the timing, pacing, and composition before any high-res work begins. I start by breaking the script down into key scenes and assembling rough sketches or placeholder images. Add temporary dialogue, music, and sound effects immediately. This is huge because the rhythm of the edit tells me how long a shot needs to be. If I find out in the animatic phase that a scene is dragging, I can cut it there in seconds, rather than after an animator has spent 2 weeks polishing a movement that eventually gets deleted. I keep the animatic simple, focusing on the camera movement and the emotional beats. This gives the animation team a clear guide on the intent and timing, which saves an enormous amount of wasted effort.
Let's touch on a rigging concept. Can you explain the basic concept of inverse kinematics, or IK, and why it's used over forward kinematics?
Sure. In forward kinematics or FK, you have to rotate every joint in a chain. If you want a hand to move, you rotate the shoulder, then the elbow, then the wrist. It is very tedious and hard to get a precise position. Inverse kinematics flips that. With IK, I just move the end effector, like the hand or the foot, to a specific point in space, and the system automatically calculates how the rest of the joints, like the elbow and shoulder, need to bend to reach that point. It makes animation so much more intuitive. If a character needs to keep their foot planted on the ground while their body moves, IK is the only way to do that efficiently. It allows the animator to focus on the pose and the goal rather than the individual rotation of every single joint.
Final technical question for you. Let's go back to the compositing stage. If you have a background plate with severe camera movement, maybe some aggressive Dutch tilts or fast pans, what specialized techniques are you using to stabilize that final composite?
When the movement is that severe, standard tracking often isn't enough. I would use 2D or 3D tracking to analyze the movement and then apply inverse transformations to counteract it. Essentially isolate the motion into its rotational, translational, and scaling components. For a Dutch tilt, I focus heavily on the rotational stabilization to level the horizon. For pans, I apply translational adjustments. If the movement is so aggressive that the pixels are warping or the traditional trackers are slipping, I would move to planar tracking or even mesh warping. This allows me to track a surface and distort it back to a stable state. Also have to be careful with the motion blur caused by those fast movements. I'll often stabilize the plate, add my CG elements, and then reapply the original camera shake and blur to the whole composite so it feels like one cohesive image rather than a static object sitting on a moving background.
This has been a great conversation. You've shown a really strong grasp of both the theoretical and practical sides of the pipeline. I appreciate the detail in your answers. We are going to be talking to a few more people, but we will get back to you shortly regarding the next steps. Do you have any quick questions for me?
I think we covered a lot, but I'm curious about how your team handles the handoff between the animation and lighting departments. Is it a very linear process, or is there a lot of iterative feedback looping between the two?
That's a great question. We actually lean towards a very iterative approach. We prefer to get rough lighting on an animation early to see if the mood works before the animation is fully polished. It helps us avoid a lot of the issues you mentioned earlier regarding the performance budget.
That sounds like a great way to work. I definitely prefer that over a waterfall approach.
Glad to hear it. Thanks again for your time today. We'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, I look forward to it. Have a great day.